Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Before we kick things off, I'll wait for people to slowly trickle on to that link. So take your time, go ahead, grab something to drink if you want, and then we'll get started soon. While we're waiting for people to come online, I want to ask you, because we know why we're all here. Obviously, we've looked at the title of this webinar. I love doing icebreakers. So I want to know what you're seeing in the landscape of psychosocial hazards, risks, safety. What's been happening for you? Why are you basically here and you've jumped onto this webinar? Have you been seeing more and more situations coming up in the workplace? Have you been facing anything in particular where you're thinking, wow, this landscape is really becoming complicated and tricky now? Or maybe you're feeling like New Zealand is a bit behind with their laws when it comes to psychosocial safety. So let me know. You've got the Q&A there, you've got the chat there if that's working. Feel free to drop your questions, anything that you have about what's been happening in the landscape. I think it's been fascinating. Um, Oh, I can see Bernie in the background, who is our event specialist in New Zealand. She has asked you all to drop in anything that you want to say around this specific question. So, what have you been seeing in psychosocial safety? What's been happening? What brought you to this webinar? So, I think it's a very interesting and timely topic, and I'm so glad that we're going to be kicking things off and talking about it. Sorry if I'm darting around. I'm just checking the numbers to see how many people have actually jumped on. What I'll do is because we've got quite a bit to cover, I'll kick things off in the next minute or so. And if you are having trouble with the sound, let me know. I can see that somebody's popped in the fact that they can't hear anything. I'm sorry if it's echoing. Um, and I can see some people dropping in messages saying that they've been seeing quite a lot of mental health issues relating to psychosocial incidents and things happening in the workplace. And some people that advise small businesses talking about how employees are taking stress leave, they're fatigued, and there are issues that are happening in the workplace relating to mental health. So I can definitely see that there are people out there that are going through the same things. And clearly, this is becoming more and more of an issue. And I'm so glad that you're here on this webinar so that we can talk about this because that is exactly why we wanted to do this one. We wanted to talk about that invisible duty. So we'll kick things off because we're 3 minutes past, and it really is quite interesting. So welcome everyone. Kia ora. Thank you so much for giving me your afternoon and coming on to this webinar and actually joining us to discuss psychosocial safety in New Zealand. And like I said to you, this is about the invisible duty. We always know that you've got health and safety when it comes to PPE, making sure that you've got your earmuffs, you've got your right boots on and all of that. But what about the psychosocial landscape that we're talking about? And for the longest time, I've heard time and time again that New Zealand is just a very unique place where we don't actually have the legislation in place to kind of govern this. If you look across the ditch at Australia, they're doing a fantastic job and not New Zealand so much. But today I want to kind of rejig that perspective a little bit and talk to you about the frameworks that we do have and what we are operating in. So like I said, welcome. My name is Sanam. I am the Employment Counsel here at Employment Hero. If you've seen me on webinars before, hi, it's the same old spiel. I have been an employment lawyer through and through for many, many years, almost a decade now. Oh my goodness, I'm getting old. And as part of that, I have worked for both employers, employees, in private practice, in-house, and I've kind of seen it all, whether it's in construction all the way through to hospitality, to just corporate jobs, whatever it is. And in amongst all of that, I thought there has to be a better way. So I actually started an employment law podcast as well. And like I said, I eat, live, and breathe the stuff. So if you ever want to check it out, it's called Employment Law Done Right. Feel free to. But what I'll do now is kick things off where we're talking about the psychosocial safety landscape. So what I will do is give you our general disclaimer as we usually do, that this is just provided to you in good faith, and this is something that we are not giving to you as advice. If you do need specific advice, the great thing is that we actually have a HR advisory team that can actually help you. So please feel free to reach out. If you have specific questions around HR advisory or anything like that, drop it in the Q&A section. And that leads me to what this webinar is all about. Well, we are going to be recording the webinar. It is going to be something that you can easily access. We'll send you the link link and or the slide deck and any additional information as well. So no need to be frantically writing everything down. I want you to sit and really understand and absorb this information because it is quite interesting. And I hope that we're presenting it in a way that's a bit unique than what you've seen before. And let me know if it isn't. And then we'll change approach for the next time. But yes, this is recorded, so no need to frantically write anything down. We will also have a Q&A portion at the end. So that's why there is a Q&A chat that's available at the bottom of your Zoom screens. So absolutely make sure that you use that. So we'll kick things off. Let's have a look at what's been happening in the space. And I wanted to specifically look at certain areas of psychosocial safety. Now, I want to preface this by saying that this is not a webinar where we are going to go through and speak about what happens when you do get a sexual harassment complaint or a bullying complaint, what you need to do step by step. That's not the aim of this webinar. This webinar is to talk to you about what obligations you have and what you need to look out for as systemic issues in your workplace that can help you tackle these particular topics and these issues. And hopefully you'll walk away with some more practical advice, practical information, practical guidance that you can kind of use and move forward with rather than more about the processes and the steps that need to be done, which is quite readily available online too. But of course, if you're dealing with a particular situation, speak to our HR advisory team. So we'll kick things off and look at the legal definition. Now, like I said, I may be darting around looking here and there, so I apologize for that. I am a one-man band at the moment doing this webinar. So I do have some notes up here on points that I really didn't want to lose along the way. So I do apologize in advance. So let's have a look at the legal definition. Now, we look at health and we look at health and well-being. We look at what the work safe definition is. We look at what the health and safety legislation says. And under section 16, there are all the definitions under the legislation of the Health and Safety at Work Act. Now, obviously, if you've heard anything buzzing around on LinkedIn, in the media, on Radio NZ, you would have heard that the Health and Safety bill is actually going through and they're doing their final call to get submissions on any other people weighing in about the bill as it's going through Parliament. So just keep that in mind that health and safety will be revamped probably before the next election if it does get passed. So the landscape is changing, but we need to operate with what we've got now. So currently, as it stands, the legislation that's basically 11 years old, we're looking at this piece of legislation and it does define health as being both physical and mental health. Now, that's important because for the longest time, like I said, we view health and safety in the sense of, I've got a worker that's had an injury or maybe a box has fallen and it's a near miss. But what happens when we move into the mental health realm and we start separating that physical health from the mental health? And that's where we start looking at the definitions under the health and safety legislation. So under section 36, as a PCBU, which is basically just an employer, a business, a sole trader, it's a person that conducts their business or undertaking. So somebody that basically engages in that work and provides that employment, they need to ensure that they meet health and safety standards so far as reasonably practicable. Now, we'll get into what that means for each area, but the best way that I can explain it to you is that now workplaces have shifted. You're not always on site anymore. There are a lot of remote workers out there. There are a lot of people that work in the corporate space that now don't necessarily work in an office. And so what we're seeing is that if you need to maintain health and safety as reasonably practicable as possible, then your workplace could mean the kitchen table. Like for someone like me, sometimes I spend quite a bit of time over there, all the way through to a work vehicle or even the office or even on site. And if you are working in those different spaces, then work is happening there. So that means that that duty that you have as an employer, as a PCBU still exists. And when we look at the obligation on employers to make sure that they provide those safe environments, we're now realizing that Okay, New Zealand does actually have certain laws and parameters in place. Of course, it's not as robust as maybe a specific piece of legislation like Australia has. But when we look at what the law requires, and as we go through the cases, you'll see that we're in a very interesting place because New Zealand doesn't only operate on health and safety legislation, they also operate within case law. And that's a lot of what frames our employment relationships, is that the cases that we see dictate what's required. So as we go through this, you'll see that there are certain psychosocial hazards that come up, and they can range. As you could see in the agenda, we were looking at things like burnout, sexual harassment, toxic work cultures, things like that. And those are all different forms of psychosocial hazards that can come up, and there's different ways that they can appear. But generally, what you see is that it's a work design or a management style or a systemic issue in the workplace. It's not usually this kind of one-off that you've seen crop up once in 10 years. It's something that's ongoing generally, and even if it's a one-off incident, it's usually things that are accepted by the business, and that's why I say that it's quite systemic. So we look at things like unrealistic deadlines, poor support, things like that that really fall into the realm of a hazard that deals more on the mental health of the particular employee rather than the physical health. And they both could be intertwined and interrelated. So, like I said, it's not about the high vis vests anymore. It's not about making sure that you're wearing the right boots in the workplace. Of course, that all matters if you've got, site specific high safety issues there. But when we're talking about the office being borderless and when we're talking about you working from home and from other places, this really shifts the dynamic there. And I think that that's the most important thing. And before we move on to the next slide, what I want to say is that what I've explained here is that health means both physical and mental health. There is a responsibility that an employer needs to ensure a workplace is as safe and healthy as reasonably practicable, which then means that you need to do your obligations as an employer, like with any health and safety situation. So you need to make sure that you identify hazards, that you assess risks, that you make sure that you've put the correct controls in place, and that you eliminate and minimize as much risk as you possibly can in the workplace. And that's where there is a disconnect. Because I think for the longest time, the conversation has always been that it's related to physical injuries, things like that. But now we're looking at, okay, what parameters can we put in place at work to reduce mental harm? So that's where the conversation has shifted. So we'll kick things off by first having a look at the most common issue that we're seeing, and it's become very much I hate saying it, but like a hot button topic effectively, and that's burnout. We're seeing burnout. We've spoken about it many times at Employment Hero on webinars where we've been talking about our well-being reports and other psychosocial webinars that we've done. And what we've found time and time again is that the numbers are always increasing, especially across New Zealand. And what we're also seeing is that people are attributing burnout to many different things. It could be things that you're dealing with in your personal life. It could be things that are happening at work. But regardless of the situation, we need to make sure that work is not exacerbating that particular burnout, and we're not creating a system which is flawed by design. So the first thing we want to kick things off with is, why does this matter health and safety wise, right? Why would burnout need to matter in this case? And the reason why I say it's about a system failure is because usually there are designs and things happening in the workplace that are causing the employee to feel overwhelmed, to feel as if they've been burdened by things. And look, there are a lot of times as well that you might come across employees that are, raising frivolous claims, or they're finding issues that are not necessarily considered as overloading them or burdening them. But as an employer, it is your obligation to make sure that you investigate and look into all of that. And it's the same thing as if you would get a bullying complaint. I hope nobody would leave that bullying complaint and just move on. I hope that people would actually, investigate and look into it and see what the actual issues are. So with burnout, we're seeing this massive shift that goes from, okay, it's not about you not actually being resilient enough. enough as an employee. It's actually to do with what's happening in the workplace and what's making employees feel like they just are not able to cope anymore, and what's happening by the work design that's causing that. And funnily enough, I actually went and had to double check this as well, because when it comes to health and safety, there's a lot of things that I feel as lawyers, even the general public, unless you work in that space day in and day out, there's a lot of things that you don't really know. And I had no idea that when it came to a notifiable offense under Section 23, mental health actually fully comes under this Section 23 as well. And it talks about hospital admission and the fact that if you get taken to hospital because you've got heart palpitations, severe panic attacks, mental health breakdowns, it could be a notifiable offense, and it could be a notifiable event, sorry, and it could be something that you do need to notify WorkSafe about. And so if you didn't notify WorkSafe, it could be considered as a legal offense and a separate offense there as well. Now, obviously, this ranges, and one of the cases that we're going to get into shortly, that will really talk to where the situation can really go in terms of burnout just spiraling and becoming the worst kind of scenario that can happen in the workplace. And also talking about a situation where if you're not investigating and looking into things properly, how that can also be creating a notifiable event as well for your workplace. So it's important. Now, obviously, you're not going to be running off to WorkSafe about everything, but making sure that you understand that that correlation that can exist there, it can bring back a lot onto the business. And I do think that the general consensus from people will be, oh, WorkSafe doesn't really care about it too much. And it's actually interesting because as we were prepping for the webinar and I was looking into these things, I saw that WorkSafe put out recent revamped and revised papers that basically said that, look, we want to change our approach to psychosocial safety. We want to make sure that this is front of mind for employers. So these are all the things you need to know. And it was one hefty document and one hefty pack. So that is clear that it is front of mind and it's something that you need to be focusing on and looking at. So I would say that this is clearly a bit of a wake-up call. And if you're not looking at this space, then it is something that you need to start having a look at. And I can clearly see from the people that drop their messages in the chat that these are things that you're facing in the workplace. So what I'm noticing is that there are common red flags that I'm seeing with burnout. And this is not just based off of, the cases that I've seen in terms of employees specifically. This is like case law that has gone to the Employment Relations Authority. We're seeing that there are certain things that create an issue where employees feel like they just cannot cope with the workload. They cannot cope at work anymore, and they feel quite undervalued and to the point of no return when they look at burnout. And it's usually things that I've seen, like chronic understaffing, the 50-hour, KPIs that are placed on a 40-hour work week, all the way through to managers that might be a little bit difficult and might not have the leadership training that they need. So when we talk about chronic understaffing, that's where we know what this is. And I'm sure if you don't have it in your workplace, you would have seen it. But if you do have it in your workplace, now's the time I would say to start thinking about it. Let your mind tick to it and think about what's actually happening. So in your particular workplace, if you have, temporary vacancies, somebody might have left. Let's say that it was somebody quite senior, and now to save budget, you've got all of that work absorbed by the existing team members, the people that already have 40 hours worth of load on their plate, and maybe they were great performers, because a lot of times what we see is for people that burn out, they were actually really good employees, very, very well performing employees, and they start feeling undervalued, they start pulling away from the work, they start becoming resentful. And one of the attributing factors could be the fact that you do have chronic understaffing in the workplace. So if you think about it and you're seeing this and you're going, this is something that I am seeing. It is really important that you take that time to go, okay, have we managed the risks around this? And like I said, go back to what I was saying. At the end of the day, this is health and safety. You're identifying hazards, you're assessing that risk, you're seeing if there is anything you can do to prevent and eliminate that risk. It still goes back to the fundamentals of health and safety legislation and what the law requires. The next thing would be the 50-hour KPIs. And I'm talking about the employees that do their 40-hour work week, and then you can see them going above and beyond that 40 hours. Not because, we do see some cases where employees might be quite slow at doing particular tasks and things, and they might drag them out compared to other team members. And that too, that can have a whole raft of other reasons. But I'm talking about the specific scenario where you know that this person has 40 hours worth of work. They contracted to do 40 hours, and then now all of a sudden another 10, 15 hours a week gets piled onto them. I can put my hand up and say that I was one of those lawyers when I worked in private practice, and we had to, work through the weekend. I remember on Sunday I went into work, and me and another lawyer looked at each other and we both said, "Oh, you're here." So if that's happening, that's a bit of an issue. And I would say let's make sure that you are keeping them within those contracted hours and not letting that get out of hand, because that is one of the leading causes of wage claims as well. So the last thing would be the managerial blind spots. Now, the reason why I called it that is, like, let's say you've got your star employee, they're amazing, they're great, and what you want to do is move them into a managerial role. That's amazing, but you realize that the managerial title didn't come with everything that's required for them to be a good leader. And what we see is that a lot of people that move into those positions of power, they create this whole trail of destruction where there's high staff turnover, you've got churning, issues with retention of staff, and then there's usually employees that are quite scared to be present and providing their opinions and their ideas in meetings. So you can see that there is something bubbling and building up there. And if you're thinking now, oh, we do have some managers that are like this, look, all hope is not lost. You change tact, and you can completely look at other avenues in terms of leadership training and giving them that support that's needed. But I understand it's not easy in a small business. But would you rather, I guess, give them that little bit of training, work with them, see if you can even do it yourself, versus dealing with a personal grievance claim that we will see where it can go to when it gets really out of hand. So I'll go into the case study for this whole area. Now, this case study, I would say, kind of falls into a bit of burnout, falls into bullying as well. It was Parker and Magnum Hire. I'm sure any of you that follow along with the law, you would have seen in 2024, this was a groundbreaking case. Everybody was shocked about this case. And it was because we had never seen such a high amount of compensation for hurt and humiliation paid to an employee. So usually compensation is a remedy that's paid at the Employment Relations Authority level, as well as at the employment court level. And usually that amount of compensation is basically to say that, look, you've had an injury to feelings, you've suffered some sort of hurt or humiliation, and this is our way to kind of compensate that. So the way that I would say it is that it kind of looks similar to damages, but it's different. And in this particular case, we were shocked when the outcome was $105,000 paid out to the employee. Now, not all of that was compensation, but I believe half of it was, and that was the highest amount we had seen paid out on record to an employee in that capacity. And what the facts really showed was that it was actually a director that had quite an aggressive management style. They were verbally abusive, and they caused a staff member to have a panic attack. And in this case, Parker ended up with severe surgical incisions that ruptured. And this is quite serious. I mean, you've now caused a physical, visceral reaction to an issue in the workplace where a manager was clearly not trained or not spoken to about their conduct and how they need to approach employees in that situation. And I'll talk about all of the issues there in terms of where this went wrong. And what we saw in that particular case was that there was a clear legal failure. And this is where I say that case law shapes a lot of what we see in the landscape. So we know that there are certain things that are a no-no because of Parker and Magnum Hire, for example. We could see in that case, and this is what the judgment said, that the harm was actually foreseeable. You could see that this harm was going to happen in some capacity because the employee was constantly berated, they were treated in an aggressive manner, there was no out for this particular employee. And we'll get into that next, because another thing that was an issue is that there was no bullying policy and there was no reporting system because there was no bullying policy. Now, that's not to say that if you just have a policy in place, you're good to go. What I would say there is that you need to make sure that you have very, very clear and proper policies in place that clearly dictate exactly what the reporting lines are, what constitutes as bullying, what doesn't, and also making sure that the employee knows their pathway that they need to go through to get some sort of resolution or to raise that complaint. And it has to be specific to your workplace. And making sure that you don't have somebody listed on there from 2 years ago that left the business is very, very key here because I do see that quite often. And in this particular case, not having that reporting system really meant that the employee had no escape from the behavior. Who would they go to? If there's no HR team, if they have no idea who they can talk to, their director is the person that's causing these issues. Who else can they go to? And sometimes the situations at work are like that, but if you can appoint somebody as a third party, maybe they don't sit at a managerial level, they're, a health and safety rep for your business, or maybe you look into what that is in terms of having somebody that kind of is the officer for health and safety in the workplace. That could be a great option too. When I worked in private practice, I was both the fire warden and also the health and safety officer. And that was a learning curve for me too. Even as an employment lawyer, I still had to learn all the ins and outs of that. But that's not to say that those resources don't exist as well. So you can absolutely set your business up in a way where you still have somebody that understands these systems and these processes. And you might have people that want to step into that role as well. So this was a clear indicator that there was a legal failure that happened. So I would say to you, if you can see in your workplace that there are issues between management and also an employee, and people are complaining about it, it might not be on paper, it might be, verbal complaints here and there. You've heard through the grapevine that, this happened in a meeting where your jaw hit the floor and you were absolutely shocked. I'm sure you've had that. I've definitely seen my fair share. And if you've seen things like that, then don't let it slide. Again, go back to the principles of health and safety. Assess your risks in the workplace. Make sure you keep track of them. Make sure that you understand that this is actually a serious issue in the workplace. And so what I would say here is that what we're seeing more than anything is that $105,000 award for an employee is a big amount of money. And that means the case law is shifting in this direction. So we want to make sure that we are keeping up with what the case law says and that companies simply saying that, oh, you get a little bit of a slap on the wrist. That's okay. We've done our job there. That's not good enough. And if for any situation that you fall into, if it ever lands in this case, I hope that you have the documentation and the registers and everything to kind of showcase that you've done your due diligence as an employer. So the next thing I wanted to get into was bullying and toxic culture. And like I said, this Parker case kind of overlaps both topics. And I thought it would be good to introduce it earlier on so that you've kind of got it in the back of your mind as we're working through these and you can look at these points and go, okay, these are definitely definitely serious areas. So bullying and toxic behavior. Now, very important that you separate the two. And like I said, this is where your policy will really come into place, where you'll really, really make sure that you clearly identify what is considered as bullying behavior, what is considered as, bad behavior, toxic behavior, misconduct in the workplace, but might not carry the same weight as bullying. Now, the best way that I can explain it is that bullying is usually persistent, which means that it's repeated and it's unreasonable behavior directed towards a particular employee and it creates a risk to their health and safety. And, that they feel that they are not able to come into the workplace, they are not able to work with the particular people that they're working with, they feel scared to share thoughts in meetings. We see it time and time again. And usually, if it goes unchecked, that's when it snowballs into something a lot bigger. And you usually will see it with, like the Parker case, where you've got an employee that's constantly dealing with it, and no one's speaking to that particular director. I mean, who would speak to a director, right? And in that case, it is quite hard. But if you've got a manager, then that's where you need to have a clear policy in place, clear understanding of what's okay and not okay. And I know it can seem commonsensical, but nothing is more important than your documentation and making sure that you've clearly outlined expectations to an employee. Because the last thing that you want is to kick off a process or to start anything, and the employee goes, I didn't know that was, considered as bullying. I was just having, a conversation with the employee. And I'll get into an example of how this can, verge on bullying sometimes. But before I do, toxic behavior is another one. So we always hear about the toxic employee, but toxic behavior are things that can happen one-off. I mean, it can be repeated, but usually what you see is it's not necessarily bullying, but it could be a hazard in the workplace. You've got an employee that all of a sudden, might have said something in passing to an employee in a meeting, or maybe I've had a situation where an employee would jump on a call with the team, and I think that their manager or somebody would always roll their eyes at them, which is awful. I would hate that, and I hope I never have to deal with that. But if that is the case, and you've got a manager, kind of rolling their eyes, doing those things, then that could be considered as a toxic behavior or a toxic trait that they've kind of presented in the workplace. Now, it is different from bullying, like I said, and what we've noticed is when we look at a practical way to kind of approach this, we usually would recommend now that you don't just wait for a formal complaint, because that is where the landscape is shifting. No more is a formal complaint going to be the thing that you need to say that, look, we didn't look into this because, it was a one-off issue. And it wasn't really that big of a deal, even though maybe the employee had been berated in front of everybody, or maybe they had been cornered in the kitchen and had a stern talking to when it wasn't the appropriate time, or they were on their lunch break, or something like that. So for the longest time, we've kind of accepted the fact that this is all okay and it's fine, and we need a more formal complaint so that we can actually investigate into it. But we've realized now that when the incident has a high bar of health and safety concerns and risks in the workplace, you need to take it upon yourself as a PCBU, as a person that owns a business, as an employer, to investigate into that and intervene immediately. And that's why sometimes what we get when we do investigations, I get this question all the time, is Sanam, we've got some complainants, they don't want to put their complaint forward, but the allegations are quite serious. What do? We can't investigate into it. Well, health and safety legislation says that you do have to investigate into it. Now, it may not be the most robust process that you do in terms of having, the specific employees interviewed in great detail and all of those things. But depending on the situation, you may have to conduct that particular process that way. And what I mentioned earlier, where I was talking about, look, you can have toxic behaviors that come up, or bullying that can happen, and it can creep up in different ways. I mean, if you look at it, one of the biggest issues I always see, especially in performance management, is that an employee will turn around and say, look, I am being, treated incorrectly in the workplace. The manager is speaking to me in such a negative way about my performance. They're belittling me. They're making me feel like I am less than. So, this performance process is actually not valid. It's not a reasonable process that I'm going under. And you can still manage somebody's performance, but not treat them in a way that's belittling them. And that's where I usually see a line taking over, where you can see, a bit of toxicity or a bit of toxic behavior kind of creeping in. And as somebody that's in the business that sits in HR, or maybe you sit as a senior manager and you're seeing this, it's important to call this out and to course correct and to fix the approach that's being taken. So what I will do now is get into some of the other aspects that we're going to look at, and that's going to be relating to, sexual harassment, and then we're going to move on to kind of auditing your processes in the workplace. Before I do, I just want to say one thing, and the reason why I'm kind of hounding and honing in on these specific points around the fact that there is this shift of duty. If we are going back to the definitions of health, if we are going back to the obligations on an employer, my question to you would be, if you had a live wire hanging and you visited a site and you saw that there was a puddle of water directly under it, what would you do in that circumstance? And that's exactly the approach that you would take in a corporate setting, in a bullying setting, when you're looking at toxic behaviors in the workplace. So just think about that, and just mull that over. Feel free to drop things in the Q&A if you want, but we'll move on to sexual harassment. Now, the first slide that I'm going to talk about, I promise I will gloss over as quickly as I can. I'll just check the time. The reason why I wanted to bring this up is because I'm still seeing contracts that have the wrong clause in them. So please remember that in 2023, we had a new amendment kind of added to the Employment Relations Act that changed the employment relations legislation. And basically what it did was it extended the time frame for a personal grievance to be raised around sexual harassment from 90 days to 12 months. So if your contracts say that in 90 days you have the time frame to raise that personal grievance for sexual harassment, they are incorrect. Please remove that clause entirely and change it to the 12 months because it is important that employees clearly understand that they are not being misled and that they have that 12-month time frame to raise that personal grievance. And it is important that if you are dealing with things in the workplace, I remember many, many years ago, there was a hospitality business that actually had a large amount of sexual harassment complaints that came through. It was a raft of them. And there was a lot of evidence that we needed to kind of, use and bring forward and have a look at as we went through the Employment Relations Authority process. And it was really important for the employer to have those, Teams records, Slack records at that time. There was no Slack or Teams. I think it was, oh no, it was Teams. It was Teams records, all of those things. And I wish I was that old. And emails and witness statements and all of that. And so when we looked at that, it was really important to have that information to hand. So if you are seeing anything kind of bubbling and brewing in the workplace, it's best not to just axe everything. Your information and the evidence that you have will be the best that you can do to protect yourself in those kinds of complaints. So just keep that in mind. Now, moving on to reasonably practicable when we're looking at preventing sexual harassment. Now, I really wanted to focus on this. And like I said, this is not the webinar where I'm going to go into all the steps on what you can do to handle a sexual harassment complaint. I wanted to take it a bit further and look at sexual harassment in relation to the health and safety legislation. If the health and safety legislation says that you need to take reasonable steps to make sure that sexual harassment is prevented in your workplace, that you need to minimize these things, because if we read in between the lines, that's essentially what the legislation is saying. Yes, it's not as clearly written as what we see across the ditch in Australia, but we still know that this exists to a certain extent. And if we can see that, and we can see that reasonable steps that you need to take are going to be things that are going to go beyond the norm. So it's not about, remember, when push comes to shove and these things get tested in the courts, when WorkSafe comes knocking, which I hope they never do, but when these things happen, it's not about your intention anymore. It's not about what you wished that you could have done or what you tried to do in terms of what you intended to do. It is about the impact that has been made and about your systems that you have in place. So what have you got in place in your workplace right now to make sure that employees are safe and they are healthy and that you've at least done right in terms of your obligations by those employees? So I wanted to discuss some prevention measures that you could put in place. And these are just some of the things that I see that have really helped. And like I said, some of these stem from the corporate world, some of these stem from construction, all the way through to working in hospitality, because there are so many different scenarios that can come up. And you kind of have to look at your workplace in when it comes to health and safety and really see what processes you need to put in place, what measures you need to put in place. So if we look at interactive training, no longer is it okay to just have a sexual harassment policy and to say that this is, what unwanted conduct is or behavior is. This is what sexual harassment means. It's no longer okay to just have a policy in place. You need to go beyond that. And if you've got a high risk workplace, I'm talking about in the hospitality sector, for example, when you have obviously, you've got your employees, but what about the patrons that come in, the customers that come in to a pub late at night or to a bar? What about the staff that are working there? Are they safe? What's happening to those staff? Have they been raising complaints about, particular customers coming in and unwanted touching, or maybe doing things to them in the workplace that they are not okay with, that they are uncomfortable with? Maybe you've seen it yourself as an employer or a manager. Now it's about looking at those kinds of scenarios and saying, look, what can we actually do to prevent this? Well, in that kind of situation, for example, we would have signage across the workplace. And if any incidents happened, unfortunately, sometimes the incident arises and then you can do something about it, like with the customer. And that's where you would maybe remove them from the premises. But moving on further than that, you might have situations where the employee themselves don't really understand what needs to be done in that particular circumstance, who they need to go to, what they need to raise. Maybe they don't really understand what sexual harassment truly looks like, and they have a different perspective of it because everyone's idea of things can be different. That's where it's important to do some real world scenario training. Maybe setting up a training course or a day or half a day where you work through and workshop different scenarios that can come up and what needs to be done in terms of reporting and who needs to find out. And also having different avenues. If this person isn't here, then who do you go to next? If this comes up, then what do you do next? And more importantly than that is making sure that your reporting lines are very, very clear. Can the person that's dealing with this, the victim, can they actually go to somebody? Can they go to their direct manager? What if their direct manager is the one doing it? I mean, look at the Parker case. The director was the person that was the person causing these issues in the workplace. So who can this employee go to? And it's really important. I would see it all the time in small businesses where when sexual harassment issues would crop up, it was usually the person that was directly either working with the employee in terms of a colleague, or it was somebody that was just above them in terms of a managerial role. And usually there would have been other avenues that they could go down. But, the whole point of these cases cropping up is usually because the employee doesn't know who to go to. So make sure that you have alternative reporting lines. And then making sure that you look at third-party risks. Who's coming into your workplace? If you're not a remote business, maybe you're on site, do you have contractors? Do you have suppliers? Do you have customers that are coming in? My example of the customers that visited the pub or the bar late at night, those are things that you're going to have a look at and see what measures you've put in place. Yes, absolutely, having signage and things like that to say what unacceptable behavior is. Now I know that this isn't the same example, but now when you go because of COVID to any bank or anything like that, you see the sign in the front that says, "Do not yell at our staff and do not yell at our tellers," and things like that. They're just trying to help you as best they can. So having signage there can really help as well and set that scene that this is unacceptable and unwanted behaviors. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is specifically in your workplaces, not dealing with customers, not dealing with third parties, but your own situations that happen in terms of Christmas parties, things that you might be doing as a nice thing for your employees. Now, I see time and time again that parameters are not set at these particular events, at these Christmas parties, and we hear horror stories, right? We hear the worst case scenarios come out of these particular events, and it's usually fueled by a lot of different things. You've got people kind of letting loose after work, you've got alcohol in the mix, you've got people that are staying out till quite late, maybe people getting a bit closer than they need to be. Things like that can happen, and it's completely normal for these things to happen in the workplace, in the sense that, look, it does come up, but how can you prevent sexual harassment and how can you make sure that you have put parameters in place? The first thing is simple things. A lot of businesses don't want to supply all kinds of liquor at their Christmas parties. Some businesses don't even supply any at all. Some people keep it to wine and beer. I know that this is, a little bit straightforward and simplistic, but having those particular measures in place, giving drink tokens where they can only have a couple of drinks, even making sure that a memo goes out prior to the event on what's acceptable, what's not, and that everyone is reminded that they've signed these policies and that they will be held to a particular standard at this particular event. Having all of that in place and making sure that you have looked at all the different risks that can come up, just like if you were on site and, like I said, that live wire was hanging just over a puddle. What would you do in that particular case? You can see the risk, you eliminate the risk or prevent it as best as you can, and you make sure that you note that down so that in future something like that doesn't happen, and you assess it and make sure that you can see exactly why that went wrong. Maybe somebody at work accidentally dropped the wire, left it like that, didn't realize, and you don't have those actual SOPs or parameters in place. And that's why it's really important. So before we wrap things up, I wanted to look at kind of the three-step audit that I would really suggest for businesses to do. And look, I know it's going to seem commonsensical, simplistic. I hear you. I completely understand. But I would say to you that there are three things that you can do right now. Like I said, look at your work design. Is your mind ticking? When I was talking about all those specific issues where employees might feel overburdened with the amount of work, maybe they're doing 40 hours worth of work, and they're contracted to do that, but they're actually doing 50, 55, 60, whatever it is. Have you actually looked at that? Are you turning a blind eye to that? Have you been noticing that in the workplace? Have you been seeing particular people speaking to employees in a negative way? And have you been receiving multiple complaints from particular employees about somebody? And yes, like I said, there might be situations where employees, you've kind of looked into it, you've taken your time to investigate, and you can see that there's not really anything substantiated there. But what we're noticing more and more with these cases is that a lot of these get unheard. They just kind of get swept under the rug, and nobody really takes the time out to actually investigate into them. Not that I'm saying that it's you, but that's just what we're generally seeing with the cases that are going to the Employment Relations Authority. And I would say audit your culture, right? Like I said, that manager, are they being difficult? Is there a high turnover? Is there, if you received a personal grievance, a lot of people don't do this, and I hope you never get one. But if you have, a lot of businesses won't look at the personal grievance and go, let me try to understand where this personal grievance really stemmed from, where it started from. Is there actually some backing behind what their statements have been and what they've said? And a lot of times, if something breaks down or if something doesn't work, you go and try to troubleshoot it, figure out what the issue was, and then you learn for next time. So why don't we do the same thing with personal grievances that are filed? Why don't we actually have a look at what caused this and what actually stemmed from this and be honest? Is it something in the business that has done this? And the last thing is your paperwork. I've said it time and time again. I know I've hounded into it many times. Audit your paperwork. It's really important to make sure that your employment agreements obviously reflect those clauses, but more so than that, it's really important to understand that your policies need to be fit for purpose, fit for your workplace. Don't just rip it from somewhere else. Like I said, we've got the HR advisory team that's there that can help you with these policies, review them for you. But it's really critical to make sure that you're not just going and just taking a policy and just running with it just because it seems like it complies with the law, because a lot of it is the gray, it's the in between. And of course you've got avenues now where you can do a quick AI kind of review of policies and things like that, but it's all of the things that you don't mention and that you leave out that are going to be the silent kind of killers when it comes to this process if you ever go through a personal grievance process. So your workplace definitions, they've become broader. Think about what workplace means for your business and for the circumstances that you're working in and in the HR capacity, for example. And I would say that it isn't necessarily about being softer in your approach with management. And I hope from this, that's not what was kind of considered or brought across, because you can run your business efficiently, commercially, effectively. But it is really important that you are looking and making sure that you are treating these particular issues, these hazards, as real, genuine risks in the workplace. Because I'm sure as the landscape keeps moving, we're going to be headed in a direction where, yes, health and safety at work legislation might not be specifically mentioning all these psychosocial hazards, but the Employment Relations Authority surely has now shown us that, look, there are certain cases here that we are seeing where this is actually a real issue when it comes to bullying, to burnout, and to these psychosocial hazards. And we are compensating the employee and we are awarding high amounts, large amounts to that particular employee. So Don't ignore these. I'm telling you, I know that it can seem like it's a lot. I can see the questions coming in, and we've got a few to get through, but not too many, which is great. But I can definitely see these issues cropping up more and more. And I would say take this time now, have a look at what you've actually got in the workplace. Look at your paperwork, and let's say if your paperwork is perfect, then make sure that the workplace design is correct and you don't have systemic issues or issues that are kicking around because you just don't want it to bubble up into a personal grievance. Trust me. All right, so we'll kick things off by doing the Q&A portion. Everyone, send me more questions. I can see that Bernie has dismissed some of these, and so somebody said that we've got the legislation. Sorry if I know that some people usually say that the the Q&A was a bit all over the place, and it's usually because, like I said, one man band, so I'm reading. So I apologize if it looks like I'm doing a few things. We've got the legislation, this person is saying, and we've got somewhat of a guideline, but very limited information on how an organization can document and report these risks. What is the standard that's expected? What I would say to everyone is just look across the ditch. Look at what Australia is doing. There is no harm in going above and beyond in terms of an employer. But again, we have the legislation in place. And what does the legislation say? That you need to identify hazards. What are the hazards? We easily know from case law now what the hazards look like. If you're overloading an employee with work, if you're seeing repeated behaviors like what was defined under the bullying section that we were talking about, if you're seeing that there's persistent unreasonable behavior directed at somebody, those are all hazards in the workplace because you would be questioning why this is happening, what's actually causing this to happen. And then from there, you're going to assess that risk and put in particular controls and measures in place so that that stops happening. And that's where we kind of tick over into that whole idea around real world training scenarios and looking at making sure that you're looking at third party risks that are happening in the workplace. So it does move into that landscape a little bit more. So that's where I would say, look, that is what's actually expected. And if you do want a really specific breakdown of a particular topic, I mean, absolutely, we're always wanting to know what you guys are interested in, but that's generally how it would work. And then somebody said if we're allowed to use what is being shared today with your own organization. Of course, absolutely. We'll send you the slides, like I said, the recording, and you can absolutely do that. I would say that if you really do need to have specific health and safety training in the workplace, then making sure that you have that is really critical. But you can absolutely do that. And that's a great way to kind of kickstart the conversation because a lot of times what I recommend is that the best thing that you can do if you're trying to build out health and safety frameworks, go to your employees. They're the best at telling you where the issues may be, what they're seeing on the floor, what they're seeing when you're not there because they're working remotely. They're the best at telling you what issues they have. And like I said to you, that situation that came up where a lot of employees were dealing with customers coming in and they were touching them unwantedly and things like that, that actually came from us sitting down with the employees and going, look, what do you guys think? This is a rough idea of what we're thinking, but we want to hear from you. And we went through a good consultation period where we understood what their gripes were, what their issues were. And a lot of it was different to what we were looking at because when you sit at a managerial level, you don't see what's happening on the ground a lot of times. And how do you ensure the well-being of staff at home when they're remote workers is another question that came up. And look, it's tricky. What you can do is you can try your best to create the most safe environment. Now, you're not there to control the fact that maybe they've got a difficult home life or anything like that. That's not on you in terms of your responsibility as an employer. But now we're seeing with the mental health side of things, with this psychosocial change in the landscape, that those things can creep into the workplace. So the question that I would ask is there anything happening in the workplace that is exacerbating that is making that worse, that you can actually prevent and eliminate as an employer? And aside from that, working from home, making sure that you've got all your other health and safety checks, ergonomic chair, sitting properly, and all that stuff. I surely don't do any of that. So if Ben's listening, sorry. And another question that we got asked as well was that you said notifiable event, and then it could be a notifiable event and what is that? So, notifiable event effectively is where you tell WorkSafe that something has happened in the workplace which is worth letting them know about, and that you're front footing it to basically tell them that this is so severe and so serious that we do need to let you know. And in that particular case, where an employee literally had their surgical incisions ruptured after they were yelled at, that is a clearly that is a notifiable incident that's happened. So it's really important to make sure that you have seen, if you see that correlation, that you do take on that responsibility. And sometimes if you look at a health and safety scenario, sometimes you just notify just to be on the safe side too. If you're in a really curly, tricky situation, like I said, get some advice around it, see what you need to do. But if you can see it's headed in that way, better to notify it rather than not. I would recommend the same thing if there was a construction place that was knocking down a wall and it knocked down the wrong way, for example. So somebody did ask that if stress leads to hospital admission, mental breakdown, but we have a case in place for a particular staff member around behavior or work ethics, do we still notify WorkSafe? Well, it's just a matter, like I said, of really understanding that balance. So if you do have parameters in the workplace and all of those things, that's fine. Your policies are there. You've got the parameters. You've told them everything, but is a manager causing the issue? Has somebody actually ticked them over and caused them to have a mental breakdown in the workplace? What's happened in the workplace for the employee to go in that direction? And that's where it's just going to be a matter of a balance between, was this actually the workplace that caused it? And you might not know in that particular case. And that's where I would say get some advice, see what a lawyer says, or alternatively, just notify if you can feel that it's already, and you can see that the evidence is already stacking up against the business. Now, somebody said that they use our NZ documentation in the platform, which is around anti-bullying, anti-harassment, and they're asking whether this meets all the requirements that we've outlined. Generally, what we do is that we keep the documents on the platform as guidance for what you need to do. Obviously, you need to tailor them for your business, but I can say that I am the one that helps with drafting a lot of these things as well, and we do get them checked every now and then. So for the most part, we try to keep them as up to date with the legislation as possible. And in terms of any other policies that you're missing, it would just be what policies you need in your particular workplace in terms of frameworks and things like that. So if you've got particular rules around, Christmas parties, work dues, and all of that kind of stuff, those are some extra policies that you might want to have or have in a handbook or send out a memo, like I said. So I'll keep the questions going, Bernie, until you tell me to exit, and hopefully we're going through as many as we can. How would you determine if someone's trip to the doctor or hospital is caused by work or their lifestyle? That's going to be a bigger question. And that's what we saw in Parker and Magnum Hire. It wasn't just a matter of this was work related, this was not. It's a matter of investigating, looking in further, seeing if it's substantiated or not. And when you're looking at it, you're looking at the balance. So on 51%, on the balance of probabilities, if 51% is saying that it is work related, then that is what you're substantiating in that particular scenario. So another person said, what if a high risk leader is the director of a company? Same thing happened in Parker and Magnum Hire. Now there has to be somebody that takes on some sort of responsibility that either either the employee knows that they are able to raise the complaint externally as well, or to go through the right avenues, because it is important to give them that ability to do that. At the end of the day, if you're somebody in HR asking this question, then you will feel a level of obligation to make sure that that employee is in a safe environment. And what I would say in that case is that you can have things built into your policy that they basically go out and they might whistleblow, but it is on the business to accept that. And it is a really tricky balance when you do have a director that's in that particular situation. So, somebody said that you have a health and safety committee. Is there any legal expectations around that? It depends on the scenario that you're in, depends on the workplace. Health and safety committee can be very, very different. It could be a health and safety committee where I was a one-man band and I was the officer in the workplace and it was a corporate environment, or you could literally have a proper unionized environment where you do have a committee, you do have a rep and somebody that kind of represents the workers and brings forth health and safety issues and is is kind of the middleman between a union stepping in and what the workplace requires of them to do. So it really truly depends on the particular workplace. And all right, we've got six more questions. Bernie, message me if you think I need to wrap up. But hopefully we can just get through this in the next few minutes. And so somebody said, isn't the system now just overloading underprepared managers to become stressed themselves? Look, I'll be honest, because that is a pretty loaded question. I think we're in an environment now where we can't ignore the fact that to move into a managerial role, you need to have additional skills outside of just the technical skills to do the job. And it's not acceptable anymore to just be good at what you do in terms of, the actual day-to-day technical work. We are seeing more and more now that you need to, no longer can you say that I haven't got the training or I haven't understood how to manage correctly. Because in certain scenarios, when you go to the Employment Relations Authority, those managers will be witnesses. They will be called into question as well. So no longer can you hide behind that. And that's the landscape that we're shifting into. Now, whether that's going to create extra stress and put stress on managers, it's more of a question of what training have you given them? What have you done to make it easier on the manager to understand how to navigate things? And I'm a huge, huge advocate. I've always been, and that's why I started the podcast, of training managers and helping them understand how to spot red flags and what they need to do so that they manage their own stress and that they understand that this is issues that can come up and you can nip it in the bud very early. But if you don't do that, then they snowball and they escalate and they become worse. So, all right. So Bernie's given me the go ahead that I can pick a couple of questions, and then we'll have to wrap it up there because I can see them coming in. And somebody has asked, let's see, sorry, I'm just got a few longer ones. Um, So I can see a lot of people saying that, employers are loading employees with extra duties and it's unreasonable, arguing it's in their contracts, but employees are still burning out. And that's where you need to make sure that you are raising these issues. And if you're a HR manager seeing it, if you're an employee seeing it, that the only way that a business can, things can go on record is if you bring them on record. And yes, if the business is not doing anything about it, then look, I'm not here to tell you to go forward and seek some advice around that or not to do that. But that is on the employee to make that decision if they want to do that. But in the best interest of the business, it's always important to make sure that you raise and flag these issues with the employer first. And look, some people have asked very interesting questions about divulging health issues and things like that, but I think this question was really, really good about how to distinguish between genuine toxic behavior versus someone that just doesn't like the other person or their style. There is so much scope for this to be subjective and very easy for employees to claim that they feel unsafe, to avoid accountability for their own behavior, and to avoid doing things they don't want to do. And again, this is where it's about making sure that you've done your investigative duties. When you receive that complaint and when somebody is saying that someone's being toxic or there's toxic behaviors, have you actually investigated into that? And when you look at it from an objective standpoint, for a normal person, and when we look at the test, what a fair and reasonable employer would do in those circumstances, when you look at that test, what does that show you? Does it show you that that particular employee may be misunderstanding something in particular? For example, if a manager asks the employee, hey, just checking in to see when this will be done, is the employee claiming that they are being heavily bullied or that they are being, hounded, micromanaged? And then you'll be able to gauge from there, okay, one message a week to check on a project from 3 months ago, maybe not as severe as something like I was saying, where a manager might be consistently rolling their eyes in a meeting or saying that, belittling them when they're looking at performance issues and things like that. I'll do one last question, Bernie, and then we'll wrap it up. I know that they keep coming in, but somebody said, let's see. There is an organization that tends to see, dealing with social services organization is what we're talking about, that tends to see this as being part of their job for workers, apart from general education about their responsibilities to staff. I'm finding it difficult to get management to understand that they need to fundamentally review their culture. Any pointers around that? Look, like I said, I am a firm believer in this stuff, and the best way that I would recommend to do it is to basically show them not necessarily what will happen to the company, but what happens to managers in those particular cases and where culture can really impact and cause issues in the workplace. Now, if you've ever if you've ever had a personal grievance come in that kind of scenario, then if the business is open to discussing some of the information around that PG, not explaining everything about that employee or anything like that, then it's really important for them to understand, especially a manager, if they were involved in that personal grievance and some of the conduct could be contributed towards what they did. It's really important for them to understand. And the best way that you can show that correlation between the two is to show them managers in this situation, if they do X based on these cases, this is what the outcomes have been. It wasn't the director or the employer of the company in a lot of situations, it was the manager. It could even be the HR team. It could even be the director, but there are a lot of cases that show managers doing this. And I would say the best way to do it is to meet them where they're at. What is the way that those particular workers or employees understand the situation? If you're dealing with a sales team, they're going to be very different to construction workers that will be on site, that will be dealing with other, issues when it comes to health and safety. So you really have to speak to your audience there. So I'll wrap things up now because Bernie will be like, we've got to be we've got to be done soon. Thank you so much, everyone. I am so glad that you jumped onto this webinar. Like I said, it was all recorded and the slides will be sent out to you as well as any additional information too. And keep an eye out. We will be putting out more information as the health and safety legislation is kind of going through its change that's happening at the moment. It all kind of came at a flurry at one time. But thank you so much. I really appreciate you all. A survey will pop up at the end of this. If you really dislike today's webinar, please be honest in the survey and let me know. And I promise I won't be too sad, but I will be. And also make sure that you let us know if you're interested in any other topics or anything else that you want to kind of delve into. We always like to get a steer from you first. So please, and like I said, connect with me on LinkedIn, reach out. I'm more than happy to chat to anybody that's, going through things or things like that, just to get a gauge of kind of what's out there in the landscape. And we have our HR advisory team too that you can always sign up to if you don't have that particular service. So thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely day, everybody. And yeah, I'll see you in the next webinar. Make sure you come to the next one.